Hello, everyone. We're back. It's a Sunday, another Sunday episode. This will hopefully be up on Sunday. We'll see. Joined again by Elliot, this time with one L and two T's. The permutations keep happening. It'll be interesting to see. Keep us all guessing.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is the way. And we're gonna do some more theory because theory with Elliot is the name of this series. And me and Elliot have many theories about everything.
Exactly. That's a theory of
Too many
everything for you.
theories. We need more application, but that's okay. You have to have the theory before you have the application. I hope everyone's doing well. We're going to get into talking about an idea that I will first and foremost say I have had a really hard time finding. I mean, I did a cursory Google search. I had a really hard time finding anything about, but this is it's maybe not even, I think it's an idea in that sense that it's a phrase that's being tossed around a lot of sort of dissident and or anti-current thing podcasts. Minimum viable religion, MVR. And or you hear different versions of it. Sometimes it's minimum viable myth, something like that. So we're going to get into this today. And I guess, like I'm saying right now, with at least speaking for myself, be the first one to say, complete ignorance about like what other people have said about this aside from just what I have heard. So yeah. Minimum viable religion. Elliot, how about here? Well, let's just share what our initial take on this concept is, because again, it's been thrown. It's one of these ideas that's thrown around as if a lot of people have written on it, right? And you're like, oh, okay, well, let me look up and see what people have written on it. And there's really not much. And so you're like,
There's
oh,
literally no literature. It's
okay,
super
so there's no
annoying.
literature. So my guess is that this is probably a somewhat newer concept, and that everybody who uses it probably means something of the same thing, but likely with very different interpretations at the same time of what this really means. This is how I understand the concept right now, Elliot, and you can chime in whenever, and we'll get the back and forth, because we got to figure out some ground. We don't need to spend the whole time doing definitions. Too many podcasts do that. Perhaps this one is guilty of that sometimes, but we need some sort of base grounding in like what we mean. So the way I understand it is, shout out to Alex Kashuta of the Subversive Podcast. This is where I first heard this idea. So so thank you to her. Everyone check out her podcast. It's very good, I think. Minimum viable religion is sort of like the minimum required beliefs, whether they be transcendent spiritual beliefs or just cultural norms, minimum required beliefs to not have a chaotic and degenerate society, something like that. I think in some ways it seems to me that it ties back, at least in inspiration or motivation, not inspiration, but motivation, to the idea of kind of like the nap, right? Like, do not hurt other people, do not take their stuff. During our nap, somewhat of a debate we did, I pushed back against it, this idea of the nap, that it just doesn't go far enough and it doesn't give you enough building blocks to have sort of a structured society. My impression is that the minimum viable religion, or MVR, is sort of a more new right answer to this sort of very libertarian nap idea, that like, okay, you're going to have more than just don't hurt people, don't take their stuff. But at the same time, you want the sort of minimum viable religion to be broad enough to where you can have something of peace and order between groups who, for better or for worse, find themselves sort of on the other end of the current thing. That's how I view it right now. Elliot, how do you interpret and or define this concept of minimum viable religion?
Yeah, and I think you're kind of right to go towards what's the purpose of it, because that's really what the concept is less important than the program, right? In a
Right.
certain way. And you're right to point out that program. I just thought of this, a really sort of quippy, like mythological perspective, right? I would say is, hey, Osiris has been killed. He's in a box somewhere. Into several pieces. Which pieces of Osiris do you grab out of the box to restart to resurrect him, and which bits do you not need to grab? Right. So if you
Well,
open the box and you're like, oh shit, I can't find his arm. Is that a problem, or is it like, whatever? His arm isn't
well,
important anyway.
as a great philosopher once asked, "What's in the box?" Um, yeah, what is in the box? Yeah, no, that's no, yeah, that's I think, yeah, it's like a we've experienced.
Well, and so if I could kind of so that would be like the very quick sort of, if you understand what that means, then just buckle up while we kind of make sure that we go through in great detail
Yeah, it's the
what we're
Biden
really
meme.
trying to get at.
Buckle up, kid. We're gonna go do MV. Yeah, anyhow, yeah.
because
Um,
here's the thing, right? It's
don't
like, okay,
nobody hop in a car with Biden, by the way. Just let him keep going. Yeah,
right, like,
don't let him pick you up.
goodness lord.
Yeah.
Because here's the sort of situation, right? Is that if we kind of agree, because the church is hemorrhaging, and I say the church meaning every church,
I mean,
right, is hemorrhaging
religions,
members.
religions,
Correct.
at least established Western religions,
Correct.
in
Are hemorrhaging
in
members. So this would
in sort of
appear.
post-industrial countries such as the United States, definitely in Europe. So
Oh, for sure.
yeah,
So if
yeah,
we kind of say that the Enlightenment killed God, right? So that is to say, God is dead, and we have killed him. Then, from a Nietzschean perspective, and there's empirical evidence to say that we have killed God, right? What was it that, like, how did we do that? So what bits of God, like, what do we do to kill God, right? What was that? What's the post-mortem, right? How do we kill him? And then the question is, how do we resurrect him? Right. And so the thought that I have here is, okay, here's the thing, is that, like, after 2000 years of Christianity, there's lots of what I would see as theological adornment or theological guardrails or whatever. It's like, yeah, okay, fair enough. Like, so I get that the Nicene Creed is a thing. What is the minimum? So is the Apostles' Creed really what you need? Or is there an even more simple statement that if you really held to it, you could bootstrap up Christianity? What are your minimum footprint? And this is the same thing with religion in general. What is the smallest set of things that would allow you to start a society-wide stabilizing religion up again? Right, starting from nihilistic atheism.
well, and Elliot, I'm gonna give a thank you to you, because you did find kind of the only somewhat literature we could find, that Elliot could find, was I'll link it to it in the description below. Micah Redding is a Christian blogger, and he is talking about minimum viable theology. And I think that's what sort of, Elliot, you're touching on here, is like that's sort of within a Christian, specifically Christian context, within a Christian theological context, what's the minimum viable theological constraints or rules or beliefs, whatever that you need. Highly recommend it. I think he wrote it, it looks like 3 or 4 years ago, and kind of wish he would have kept going with it, because he was only like 3 entries and it was great. But I will still link it. It's so from pointy-headed in-group Christian perspective, at least one person's written on minimum viable theology. But the way I interpret, and I think, Elliot, you would agree, the way I am interpreting minimum viable religion is on more of a civic religion sense. So not looking so much about what is objective spiritual reality aside, right? What
Yes.
do humans in a society need to accept and reject? Remember that whole the right hand and the left hand thing from the Bart episode, if people haven't. Yeah. What do people need to accept and reject in order to have like the basic level of like framework to have some sort of culture that does not completely go off the rails on a crazy train, and does not completely like either like dynamite itself, or just like lay down and die. And so this is a thing too, and maybe this is a this is a transition I'm gonna force through. I have somewhat of an issue with people talking about minimum viable religion, only because religion is as a concept, as a word, is almost impossible to give one definition for. So much so that anybody who writes about religion, like in academia, I'll raise my hand, I guess. Like anytime you say religion, you have to spend like 5 pages defining what you individual person mean by religion, because even scholars of like human religions define it very differently. So it's kind of a nightmare term in the sense that it's like so hard to define. I've also heard people talk about minimum viable myth. And so I really like this. I kind of lean, I know that that's a weird, autist level. I prefer this, but I do prefer it because myth. So like, you don't have to believe or reject the objective spiritual reality of a myth for it to mean something to you, right? So like, if you are not Christian, but you find great resonance, maybe in like, I don't know, in Aquinas's thought, right? You can accept sort of what Aquinas is talking about conceptually, even though you maybe don't subscribe to what Aquinas believed, or what you just brought up, Elliot, right? Osiris, right? Being dismembered in a box. I don't don't follow ancient Egyptian religion, right? But I can look at that story and go, yes, that's like a perfect mythological analog to what we're experiencing right now. So I don't know. Again, call it what you want. Minimum viable myth, I think, works too, because myths don't need to be. You don't need to like stake your soul on them, so to speak. They don't ask this sort of question of ultimate concern, to borrow a term from Paul Tillich. They're just like, this is a story that's passed down. It has great meaning. You need not accept it as sort of your overarching spiritual truth. So I kind of dig that. I don't know.
No. So it's kind of interesting,
perhaps
right?
overly autist about it, but no, minimum viable myth works too, because there's a myth of every country, right? Or at least there should be. Every culture or country, polity, whatever, should have some idea of like, what is it? Why are we here? How are we here? Where are we going? Right? Again, we're like scraping the bottom. We're scraping the bottom of the barrel for like what we need here. It's not like, you can't, it's also not that you can build a whole society based only on that, but it's that in order to have something of a society, you have to have at least some sort of shared concept, mythological concept. And it need not be spiritually transcendent, but it could be transcendent through time, over time, right? Where are we coming from? Where are we going to? I don't
Correct.
know.
And I think
Yeah.
no, that's actually a really good way of kind of framing a little bit of what we're trying to do here, right? Because I think all I'm trying to do, because it's tough to it's interesting because the dissident right is in this weird situation where it is self-aware in its desire to be separate from itself in a certain way. It's people who are bound together by the notion that we have unique flukes and differences, and we'd love to be left alone and to be different in our own
Yeah.
quadrants.
Oh, yeah.
Differently, right?
Yes.
But we have noticed that we are all more similar to each other, even though we have surface level differences in the generic sensibilities. And so we're in this awkward position where if we got our way, none of us would be friends anymore, so to speak.
Right.
Not to say that we wouldn't be friendly, but like we would be off in our own communities,
Yeah.
not talking to each other.
We wouldn't be ideological. Yeah, we would be sort of somewhat siloed a little bit, on like intentionally siloed in that, hey, hi neighbor, isn't that great? Wasn't it great that the Packers won yesterday or something like that? Okay, thanks, bye, go back in your house, right? Like kind of like cordially there, but not like, yeah, these would, I don't want to say in the wild, but because what would that even look like? But in a way, by rights, these movements shouldn't even be one. They
exactly.
are forced into one by nature of the sort of neoliberal situation that everyone finds themselves in. And so
because the neoliberal order progresses in every direction away from the
Yeah,
current state, which sounds weird, but it's actually the case. You necessarily then have reactionaries in every direction who
yeah,
are only bound together by their reaction to the neoliberal progressive program.
yeah, yeah. No, yeah, they wouldn't even, yeah. And this is now this is just, I guess I'll make a side jab against people who view the quote unquote new right. I mean, I use the term too because it's a shorthand term, right? But I'm like, this is not one movement. And I think,
Yeah.
Michael Malice in his book on the new right really shows this. It is really not one thing at all. Like real deep rifts between these groups because they're not one group and they've never have been. But there's this interesting kind of maybe finding a piece in the feud, referencing to something else we've talked about. Out of necessity, right? There's the neighboring tribes who are feuding, but then there's the bigger empire coming. We better get our act together and find some sort of minimum viable belief system that both of our traditions, or well, there's more than two, right? That all of our many traditions, whether that's sort of, atheist objectivism or neo-pagan, restorationism, or whether it's trad-cath integralism, or whether it's based Protestantism, hey, I'm all for that, or whatever it is, right? What's the base minimum things that we can agree on to galvanize perhaps ourselves against this thing, which you quite rightly point out is progressing in all directions simultaneously, which is also makes it incredibly hard to pin down what progressivism really is. So anyhow, sorry.
Well, and
Yeah.
no, and this is really important, Riff, actually, and it's not just infinite throat clearing. I think actually we do progress towards a point, right? And
Right.
so again, to kind of continue to contextualize the program here, it's that I woke up one day and decided that the series of ridiculously, like, absurdly pretentious labels I would probably have to apply to myself, right, is something along the lines of a postmodern what is it? Postmodern pro-actionary meta-traditionalist, right?
So
Right. And it's
what
like,
are your pronouns?
yeah, exactly.
I'm
And
here
everybody is
identifying
like,
as, yeah.
and that might as well be a leftist meme. Like, literally it kind of is, but in a certain sense everything actually has relevant meaning. Postmodern meaning that, like, I've totally left the modernist paradigm aside and I'm living in the postmodern paradigm, in basically meme culture rules the world, right?
Yep.
The second one being pro-actionary. So I'm already against the next leftist
Right.
thing
Already
before
against.
they've even come up with it. So
Yeah.
the question is, how do you proactively come up with reactions against the next nonsense thing before it even has the chance to congeal into its nonsense form?
Yep.
Which is actually a pretty decent point to think about.
You're
And
fighting
then meta
you're fighting the time
traditionalists,
war. You're fighting the time war.
I'm fighting the time war, yo.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to hit them from the future, yo.
Yep.
And then the last part
This is
being
some
meta
Sarah Connor shit you're
traditionalist.
doing here. This is some real Sarah Connor shit. You're this is,
I'm
yeah,
trying to resurrect God so that the freaking Terminator can come back and save us all.
something like that. Yeah.
And then the last one being meta traditionalist, of like, hey, I noticed that tradition is really important. And then when I talk to people about tradition, they're like, but all these specific things are totally mandatory for a tradition. I'm like, okay, objectively, you're wrong. So, like, we have to figure out a way of, like, sort of, and this is where you're trying to square the circle, genuinely speaking, where you're trying to be like, hey, can we come up with some ways in which, like, we all are able to do our own traditions separately and devoutly, and think that the other people are going to hell, while still being able to, in this sort of tribal band way, come together coherently, versus, you know, uh, uh, you know, forces that would seek to divide and conquer. So, is there any way of creating a sort of mycelia layer, or rhizomatic thinking, to drop another Tomo thing in there, amongst right wingers, to ensure that were impossible to get rid of, essentially. And I know that sounds weird because you're like, well, Elliot, how are you trying to apply non-hierarchical thinking to hierarchical thinkers? Well, hey, man, I'm trying to do that through saying at the top of the hierarchy is this meta tradition or minimal viable tradition, minimum viable religion, all of these minimum viables, with the intent of hopefully we can all agree explicitly on these things and then go and do our own things, but be able to be united by the meta points, right, versus the chaos people, right? So
no, hey, and so we got, so now, man, you talk about pretension. This is a pretension welcome. Pretension is welcome here. You can't do theory without being pretentious, and
so true.
Theory, pretentious people are drawn to theory, so it's a chicken and the egg.
True.
We got MVT, so minimum viable tradition. We got MVR, minimum viable religion, and or MVM, minimum viable mythology. I'm fine with all any or like that's fine, right? They're all basically the same thing. I mean, basically,
exactly.
It's like, yeah. Well, I think that's, again, others will likely define this differently, but I do think that's a fairly decent, like that to use a term that maybe philosophy is not so happy with, that feels right. That feels like a well-rounded, very general by definition, because it's a general thing. You know, MVR is a general idea. It's like what generally binds us together, and what can we use to push out the people who, like you said, the chaos people, the cult of Cthulhu. So how would you, if I'm gonna be the accountable monarch of the show, and I'm gonna take the reins, and I'm gonna steer us to the next, we're gonna take the turn into the next thing. Not the next current thing, but just the next thing. Chill out, Elliot. It's okay. The next thing, which is what principles. So we've worked together sort of to make a basic definition of, minimum viable religion. What principles, Elliot, do you think would qualify? Like, so what are the minimum viable traditions or religious points or myths that people would need to share in order to not be consumed by the chaos people?
Yeah, and so that's
a harder question. Yeah,
no, it's very hard, and it's kind of the whole point.
I have a few ideas, but I talk too much, even though it is my show. I talk too much, and I want to mine your brain for this. So
no, and I think and as we were talking about before the show, if we were going to, because both of us, being from having our backgrounds, have in some ways been on the left or on the right, and so if we were going to be right winger, we would continue to viciously pursue definitions for the next hour, and if we were left, we would viciously plug how cool and detailed and deep our thoughts are about to be, and
plug our Patreons.
Neither. And plug our Patreon.
Plug our Patreon.
And how this is going to be a money-making machine for the next whatever the heck.
I know we got a small channel, but we love you all, and we do not. There should be no ads popping up. This is non-monetized. This is for the ideas, man. We don't make money doing this, and I wouldn't want to make money doing this. It's the joy is in doing the thing itself. I'm very Benedictine in this, but that's fine.
Well, no, and we'll figure out some other way to grift off this sort of thing.
Well, the grift will not be from you all. The grift, we don't want to target no listener targeted grift around here. We don't like that. We don't like that.
As L. Ron Hubbard said, forget business, go with religion, right? He didn't say it like
L. Ron Hubbard.
Religion is how you make money.
You're just trying to trigger me right now. You're trying to distract me.
No, but really though, Scientology is actually a fantastic example of this, because actually, in a certain way, if you're going to think through, because here's kind of the issue, right? Is that religion, honestly, is sort of it really is an outsider word. All right. So everybody has a religion, but the only people to ever think about religion as religion is actually Christians, because almost nobody else has ever thought about religion as such.
That is an interesting idea. While I refrain from comment on that because it's not ultimately what we're talking about, if I were to give, to teach a class on religious studies, I would have some things to say about that. All I will say, not even disagree, just to say about that. All I will say is there have been others who have defined religion in a similar way to what you have, There are people who define religion, and I'm not agreeing or disagreeing. It's really not what it's about. But I would be remiss of me to not say that there are people who would define religion as a purely Abrahamic concept, meaning
Yes. Okay. Fair enough.
Jewish, Christian, Muslim, because the term itself, the concept itself, loses meaning outside of those traditions, because you don't have the same squabbles over whose book is the right book, whose translation of the book is the right book, because you don't have, it's not that you don't have sacred texts in other traditions, but this idea of scripture, capital S, is like a very Abrahamic thing. Like that, this is the revealed word of God, not just things about God, but like God says this thing to you as recorded in this book. It is actually, it's interesting. Give me a few more minutes. It's a small tangent, but it's interesting.
Keep going. This is perfect.
Chesterton talked about how people in the West, regardless of whether they're Christian, Jewish, or Muslim or not, people who live in cultures that have been heavily influenced by Abrahamic traditions, which we all would include most of us, I think. If we got, perhaps not all viewers, but if anyone in the United States, anyone in Europe, definitely 100%. You view these concepts as kind of normal. Well, of course, there's like some sacred book that has the revealed word of our deity. Okay, yeah, that concept's like really specific to these three faiths. Now, they happen to be, or at least Christianity and Islam are the biggest religions in the world, so it becomes sort of normalized by just number of adherents, right? But when you think about it, that's actually kind of strange. It's actually very strange and weird. And so it's not just religious studies scholars, it's even Christian thinkers themselves, or people in Abrahamic traditions themselves, such as Chesterton, who would point this out. So yeah, we it's one of these things where religion, maybe as a concept, is so specifically Western and or Abrahamic that maybe it's not a big enough tent to bind desperate and disparate, both terms, groups together. And that's why, I guess, to bring it back, that's, I think, maybe minimum viable myth, or even tradition, because right, you do have traditions that you do that need not have transcendent value at all, right? Like every morning I brush my teeth because I don't want my teeth to fall out. Well, there's a reason behind that. You do that for a reason. It's very clear why you do that. I run so that I'm not a fat piece of crap. Oh, okay, well, there's a reason behind that. It need not be transcendent. It's just like, oh, well, of course you want to stay healthy and not be, these things.
But I would, so I have a couple.
Those are traditions. Traditions need not be mystical, right? Traditions are very grounded oftentimes in even the supposed, even if you take them outside of their mystical contexts, like, you can look at sort of often, religions that have sort of prescribed ways of like washing before doing certain ritual acts. You can say, well, of course, the washing might have some sort of, spiritual connotation of cleansing or cleaning, but it probably also has something to do with like, don't be dirty when you're going into the place of worship because you might get everyone sick. So, right, like there's a lot. Tradition is just sort of, whether it's capital T, Fiddler on the Roof style, or just a regular tradition of like, I do this every day. That's even a broader tent, because even people who don't subscribe to, transcendent ideologies can still find value in that, we hope, right? Like, again, I know I kind of spent a whole episode shitting on it somewhat, but it's not all bad. The nap, right? Don't kill people. Okay, yeah, don't hurt people. Don't take their stuff. I mean, that's like kind of standard. I don't know. Again, I think when it comes to MVR, the more broader you cast, you frame it, and the wider you cast the net, I think that's more in spirit of what it's supposed to do. Because as you pointed out earlier in the episode, it's more of a program rather than, it's not an ideology, it's like a program. So
right. And so it's interesting, because I would invite your listeners to consider that when we talk about in the Abrahamic religion context of like, there is a sacred text, right? This has hidden in it that this society is literate and venerates literacy on some level. Of course, ancient Hebrews and ancient Muslims and Christians largely were illiterate, but that didn't matter. Like at some point in the Christian and Jewish ritual during service, they literally hold up a book
Yep.
as an object of veneration, in addition to the other venerable objects or instruments used to bring us closer to God, like bread and wine in the Christian sense, or other stuff in the Jewish sense.
Bread and wine have also have great meaning for Jewish people as well. They're not sacraments the same way, definitely not. But they're like, if you've ever gone to a service at your favorite synagogue with your favorite people. I've been the token goy. I am a token.
Mhm.
I'm a token goy because I speak Yiddish, so they sometimes bring me along and I can talk to the grandmas. It's very I'm the monstrosity, but in a good way. Look at the goy, he speaks Yiddish. But yeah, no, it's interesting. You, at least sort of anecdotally, when you're
Yeah.
somebody who's very Christian, and then you go to Jewish services, you're like, oh, I mean, it's very different. But you can also see this through line of like, oh, the word, right? The book, the
Yeah.
word.
Yeah.
This is a thing that people, specifically Jewish people, take very seriously. Like, right, like
Mhm.
you kind of feel like a shemo. You're like, oh, like we just like turn your hymnals open or turn your Bibles to page blah blah blah, and it's just like, here we go, we're opening the and it's like, oh, they have the original language and it's a Torah, it's a Torah, and it's really pretty and it's really expensive and it was done by hand, and you're like, we're low effort people compared to this. I'm like, you feel like sort of spiritually underdressed. You're like, oh my gosh, we don't do any of this stuff. And I understand that, right? Catholics have more of that, and the Eastern Orthodox Ortho-Chads have even more of that. So that is just, I'm only calling out my own tribe on that one. But yeah,
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
through line
Mhm.
through all of the, thousands of years of religious differences is, oh, this tradition, you see, this tradition, my tradition comes from this tradition. The emphasis on printed word, on written word, on word read aloud, recited. It must be exactly recited with the exact same pronunciation as close as possible, right? Like there's a whole, thing about that. That is something, yeah, that again, it feels normal, like, at least to me, because it's what I believe, but also it's the culture I was raised in. But like in the history of humanity, it's actually kind of strange. I mean, it's really strange. That anyone figured out how to read and write at all, and that then anyone poured so much sort of spiritual skill points, if you will, into this, like that this book really matters. This is the most, that reading matters, that words matter, but that this one particular book is the book, and everything, we always refer back to this one thing. Because for like thousands of years, again, I'm on a tangent now, apologies, but for thousands, I guess my point is, it is unique. It is not, for most of human history, that's not how tradition was transmitted. And that's not to say that transmission, like sort of oral transmission of tradition, is not important. It's not, and that's not to say it's not valuable. Of course it is, but it's just different. And yeah, so I guess, I don't know, I guess I'm just trying to bolster my argument that like that maybe minimum viable religion is not even where we need to go. Maybe it's just minimum viable myth or minimum viable tradition in general, that like, because how does that, if the concept of religion is so specifically Abrahamic, how you're going to lose people, right? You're going to lose people.
Not necessarily. So,
Yeah.
and actually, I want to. So it's interesting because I've been thinking about this for a little while. Of like, is it enough to have a MVT, minimal viable tradition, right? That everybody's explicitly entering into together. We all brush our teeth, type of stuff, right?
Right. Everyone poops.
Right, and stuff like that, and that might be possible, but
Right.
and the minimum viable myth is 100% a worthwhile, in my mind, sub goal of the minimum viable religion, right? Like, I think that it is required. It's a component of the minimal viable religion, of the MVM, the minimal viable myth, right?
Yeah.
I think that is an important component. So I don't see those two things at odds even a little bit. But I want to like kind of offer the following thing, because we've called social justice folks religious, right? They're atheist explicitly for the most part, but they transcend,
Which is
right? Because there's many, it's sort of a meta religion, right? Which is how I know that this
it
sort of
makes a
thing can
statement about the
happen.
spiritual world. and people live
It
out
makes
their lives accordingly.
but it's able to fit itself across many different traditions. Episcopalians, some versions of Muslims, atheists, all of these people feel very comfortable adopting basically all the tenets of what we would say are this religion. And so it's interesting that it's gotten to the point where somebody else's religion, because okay, to back up for a second, but to clarify this story, is that basically part of what religions do, right? Things religions do include, but are not limited to, preventing nihilism by giving meaning,
Yep.
and resolving the big questions. Now, what's interesting about that is that sufficiently compelling religions, even if you don't believe in the religion, can still prevent nihilism from you by giving you meaning that you fight against, and and wrong resolutions to the big questions. So it's interesting that I was sitting there in a bathroom, right? And I just washed my hands and I was going to go to, and there was this little sign they had on the left hand side, the paper towels. On the right hand side, they had one of those Dyson blowers, right? And on the Dyson blower, they said, please think about the environment, use use the blower. And so I purposefully took the paper towels, firstly because I prefer the paper towels over the dryers as a pure sense, but also as a fuck you, I don't believe in your environmentalist religion, right? So it's interesting that they think about that like an atheist who is like, remember the Holy Spirit, let it
Yeah.
blow across your hands. An
Or
atheist might to choose the paper towels to say, fuck your Bible, I'm wiping my hands on your scripture. And so it's interesting how religions can actually give non-adherence meanings too.
yeah. Yeah, no, and then yeah, and like yeah, from a very frozen chosen Lutheran perspective, right? I say remember your baptism, right? All that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's no, that's a really good point. And I like that it happened on the toilet, or at least leaving the toilet, because also Reformation Day is coming up. Let me gush. Because Luther had a big, Luther's big thing about grace was had when he was having horrendous diarrhea on what passed for a toilet back in the day. So toilet-based religious epiphanies are very welcome here, Elliot.
No,
Um,
no, absolutely.
Lutherans are
I think
highly
in
scatological people, and in many ways it's a joke and a troll, but it's also true. Our religion is kind of based on poop. At least our interpretation of the Christian religion is very poop based. And it's actually true, like you can prove it. And I think that's actually an advantage because everyone poops and it's a universal experience and it gets people to laugh and you can tell them something about, well, what do you think? Well, poop. I'm half joking here, but I'm half serious. Yeah, no, it's a good it gives people something to react against. You know,
well, and so the point of that story is to underscore I could have enjoyed being a part of a tradition of like my fathers and forefathers wiped their hands after washing them, right? But because there was a religion at play, it gave me additional meanings where my actions of wiping my hands were not mere embodiment of me in this moment in the lineage of humans, but also gave me the chance to express my values. And that's really kind of a purpose of religion, is allowing you opportunities through mundane acts, make mundane acts spiritual, which is something I get from the Zen people, right? And so kind of part of the reason why this has been really important to me is like, how do you, like, basically Shinto Japan is a really like a tough nut to crack for me, that's been very fruitful to think through in terms of religion. And actually I think that in terms of the minimal viable religion, Shinto Japan, you could do much worse, right? I don't like Zen. I think Zen Buddhism or Chan Buddhism is too far in the direction. And I don't mean it's sort of tricky because a lot of Zen Buddhists are like, what do you mean? We're just as rich in terms of our, tradition as, Vajrayana Buddhists or whatever, right? Which I'm purposefully, if you don't get the terms, don't worry about it. Well, I'll use Western examples too, don't worry. But basically Zen is way too far in like the actual conception of everything is sacred, nothing is whatever the heck, because even the Zen Buddhists have tried to enrich that basic minimum it's basically very hard to get too trimmed down, right? So it's kind of interesting that I have this hypothesis that any sufficiently advanced denomination uh, will over time resemble Catholicism within the Christian context, because Catholicism is just what happens when you enrich a tradition over 2,000 years. Because Catholicism started out very bare bones too. And so there's this notion, to kind of understand what I'm talking about here, there's this notion of what I like to say generic Christianity, which we all know. It's sort of like not quite a megachurch, but they go in there and they sing some of the most banal songs. Usually you could write them on a napkin using the same 5 words of like, holy God, he
Well,
saves, it's raining.
I'm going to push back a bit. What you're describing is sort of the general Americanized evangelical Christianity, which
is generic,
quite recent.
Exactly.
Almost brand new in the history.
Because Lutherans are significantly more Catholic than that. And the reason why I bring them up is like, oh, Elliot, are you trying to make everything generic Christianity? I'm like, no. That's not the purpose. The purpose is not to strip away the Catholicism or the Orthodoxy or even the Lutheranism, if that's where you're looking for, or I want like a few tappings. The point is that all of those guys do have the Nicene Creed that binds them all together. So we come up with a cross-religion Nicene Creed that works for Shintos and pagans and Christians and Muslims and everybody, polytheists and monotheists and panentheists and whatnot. And I think we can. And the purpose of this is to sort of, I think the problem with a lot of religious people is that we hang our hats on a lot of very irrelevant things that we think are quite relevant, right? So we hang our hats on like God being necessary because of the universe, right? Oh, he is the first mover in an Aristotelian sense, not in the sort of he was the first action, right? And that gets a lot of people converted into atheism, which then as if you're not following an atheistic religion like atheism plus or like the new left or like communism or social justice or whatever, then you tend to fall directly into actual nihilism, right? So what is the sort of, hey, you can debunk all of the specific claims you want, but there is still this fundamental religious core that everybody shares ultimately that you can't debunk, Mr. Atheist. And so it's sort of permanently atheist proofing religion, right?
Well, yeah. Again, this is maybe, I hear what you're saying. I don't necessarily disagree. My grumble is, I'm going to come back to it. It's just, this is the autism at work, I guess. My grumbling is with this idea that like minimum viable religion does not seek to supplant or change religions, because there is you get pushback from people because actually I would argue that there is great value in caring a whole heck of a lot, obviously I do, biased, about the specifics of what your tradition does, teaches and or does, or however you want to describe it. That's actually really important. This smoothing over of differences is a leftist thing. This is, and I know that's not what you're saying, but the problem I think we might be running into, and again, I'm trying to anticipate the problems as they come. I'm trying to fight the future. Doing that type more, is that, that this either becomes sort of a weird crypto leftist thing or just turns people off. The issue is with finding, again, maybe it's just back to what we were talking about earlier. If you can find a piece in the feud, you can still have your disagreements. You can still have all those disparate traditions that are quite different from one another. All you're trying to do is figure out how to not be swallowed by, the jaws of Fenrir as he comes to swallow everything, right? Like, that's really what I think the motivation should be here.
Well, so let me give another example, the
specifics are important because we're not really talking about the specifics here. We're talking about like in a way, the survival of religion as a concept that is not tied to one specific ideology.
Yes.
So
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so actually, I think maybe a better example would be, my intention here isn't to, so it's sort of like, you're familiar with how the NATO military rankings work, right? Where
No.
essentially, okay, fair enough. So in the US military, people who are familiar with this sphere are going to be maybe familiar with the term the E4 mafia, right? Which is where you have people who are like the lowest level officers, but you know, so they're the kind of lowest ranking officers essentially is the E4 mafia. And essentially like it's kind of a sort of like heckler's veto of like, hey, if you cross, these are all the guys that literally can get things done. Everybody else is just bossing somebody else around to tell them to do a thing. The E4s literally know the guys that are going to actually get the things done. So unless you don't have it's sort of like, you know, Rousseau's like will of the people. Like if you don't have the buy-in with the E4s, literally nothing can get done. So this begs the question: what the heck is an E4? Well, it's an enlisted rank 4 out of 10, and you have O's, right, for officers, right? So you'd have O1 through 10 and E1 through 10. So why do I even bring this up? Well, it turns out that, you know, we have all sorts of fancy words like sergeant and staff sergeant and private. And if you go, and there's a very entertaining video where a guy looks up the original etymology of all these words and re-ranks all of the military hierarchies based off of their actual meaning, because he's like, field marshal, that sounds really great when you until you realize the initial field means just in the field, right? And then marshal literally just means like dude. So you're like, field dude, not important, bottom of the list, right? And you're like,
Okay, so but how does this, okay, so connect this back to what we're
so
talking
how
about.
does this relate? So you have all these funky military jargons across many different European armies and world armies, but you still had to have a unified NATO command versus Russia, right? Because if you tried to unify everybody into one army, well, then you know better than the communists, right? So you have to keep national distinctions, but how do you as a bunch of nations mobilize versus the communist threat? What you did is you had NATO command structure where you can call your dudes whatever the fuck you want to call them. You can give them whatever the fuck uniforms you want, as long as you use the E1 through E10 or O10 ranking system and plug the names that you're going to use into those E and O ranking systems, then we can fight as a unified force, because we're going to write all of our combat stuff in terms of E's and O's and stuff. And then we can say, hey, the playbook is the following: E7s do this, E8s do that. Now we all know what we mean. We're happy, done. And so that's really more of what I'm trying to do here. Is I'm not telling you how to run your army. I'm just saying that when we come together, here is the playbook, right? The playbook is this, this, and this. And to allow for, and part of the meta tradition here is really in line with what oh goodness, the hero with 1,000 faces guy,
Campbell. Joseph Campbell.
Joseph Campbell. It's really in line with like Jung and Campbell and Alan Watts and all these folks who really love and respect multiple traditions and are not trying to usurp individual religions by generalizing. They're trying to, and you'll hear this from really based preachers and priests and stuff. They say, hey, you will not understand Christianity until you seriously investigate another religion. So go study another religion so that you can actually understand what you're saying, right?
I'd agree.
And so given that that's the case, like my thing is not even to gloss over differences. My notion here is like, hey, we know that there are some really root fundamental things that we all know are very important in our own traditions and for other people's traditions. How do we know that? Because we're very passionately saying, don't do what that other guy does in this specific context.
So in that vein, let's, again, we don't have to do it right now. There's no way we could do it right now. It's too complex, but what are some, I can think of at least one or two main core principles of MVR, but I'm more interested in what is at least one thing that you think should hold across all different traditions?
Yep. So I think an easy MVR principle is an easy MVR principle is you should not commit suicide before you reproduce. That would be an example of,
wow. You're writing for the atheists here. I like it.
Well, yeah, no, it has to be a little
has
bit,
to
right? I
be,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
we could, you know, we could refine that and put it into language. And again, like if you're familiar with Dune, you're like Elliot, you're just trying to be a
I'm
Benny
a Dune
Gesserit, and
person.
you're like, yes, I am. What are you talking about? Like, of course, but point being is that like
You are not the Kwisatz Haderach. I will tell you that much. You might think you are.
I'm really not. No, I'm
You're really
definitely not.
not.
But
Yeah.
um, so
Um,
basically that would be, I think, and the reason why I think that's fundamentally cornerstone first principle in my mind is because it encapsulates both you should keep existing and you should make a family in one sentence. It kind of has both wrapped up in it. And
I
the
mean,
reason
you said until you, I'm going to push back. You said until you reproduce, you just should.
reproduce.
I'm going to say no. You just shouldn't kill yourself, because reproduction is just one part of that. You need people to stay alive as long as possible in order to have stable family units. So I'm going to remove.
Sure,
I'm going to remove the until. I'm going to say, don't kill yourself.
So and part of the purpose of this, I think, is in my mind is to kind of it's similar to a mathematical perspective. You start with like literally non-objectionable things, stuff that literally nobody can object to, and then you marry those non-objectionable things up into implications that follow, right? So
Yeah.
that sort of the reason why I put that my version of that in there is because any species that accepts the opposite of that particular one will go extinct, and so it's literally anti what religions are trying
Well,
to do.
right, and we're not
Cults
just
are
looking for
able,
existence here, though. Let's set the goal a little higher. We're looking
exactly.
for an ordered, for a society that works. So
No,
existence,
no, for sure.
like living in our own shit and dying at 20. Let's
Yep,
look
yep.
a little higher than that, is what I would
No,
say.
no, but
Yeah,
again,
yeah.
well, yeah, a little higher, but we're trying to start like very
I get
like
it.
this is the
But
first.
but
Yeah,
I
this
would
is
say,
first
but
principle.
from a first principles perspective, if you have to get this squared away right away, otherwise you're gonna get a, well, why don't we just? Because you're gonna have the people who go, why don't we just?
No, no, and that made fair enough, right?
Yeah,
So if I was going to stack on my first principle,
pretty good.
it would be that one. Now, the next one I would probably stack on in that vein, right, might be, um, you know, in general, like existence is better than
Yes,
non-existence, right,
yes.
or something like that,
Existence
right?
is
Like
better than non-existence. Yes.
right, and not with the explicit purpose of then being able to go back and extend the non-suicidal one to say, okay, like we have this basic principles of this is the totally minimum bar, right?
Yeah.
You got to reproduce and then you can do what you want.
I would add, I want to add another one, and I don't know what
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
we could quibble about the order. These are not in order.
Yeah, I don't care about the
Yeah, the
order at
order
all
would
right
come
now.
later.
Yeah,
Um, there is a difference. I understand that ultimately it is somewhat arbitrary where you draw the line. I understand that that's a problem with this statement, but I'm still going to say it. There is a difference between children and adults. And this is something that different cultures have defined differently at all different periods. But most cultures have some rites of passage where you transition from child to adult, whether it's a bar bat mitzvah, whether it's like a confirmation, to borrow a Lutheran term or Catholic term, whether it's you got to go kill a lion, or whether you gotta, I don't know, right? But there is a difference between children and adults. I think that's another one, because it connects to the concept of reproduction. And I think when you lose that, and I'm not saying like all of a sudden you switch a dial and all of a sudden someone is an adult, right? It's a gradual process, of course, of growing up. But I do think a culture needs to recognize at some point, right? And we do this to a certain extent. We do it poorly in the West, but at least in America, we have this weird fudgy thing. Is it 18 or is it 21, right? Depending on what you want to talking about, which is kind of stupid. But you have to have that baked in. Because if you don't have that baked in, well, all I will say is, since I'd like this to channel to keep surviving, is you run into problems that we're seeing right now, and that cultures of the past have also ran into, usually when they're dying. So that would be another one that I would push for. is, and again, the order we'd have to squabble over, and that's fine. But because
Yeah, yeah.
it is so fundamental to delineating family structures and kinship structures, and which is sort of the basis that you build any society on.
Which by the way, to kind of clarify, I think what my approach in this is some of these are coming from, you know, what we've said in previous episodes, or what I've said in previous episodes, where I'm like, hey, there are some. Actually, hold on, I'll backpedal for a second, and I'll say the following: where the notion for me in part of a minimal viable religion is a set of memes that propagates across generations,
I like
and
that.
that is not necessarily a personal practice.
Mhm.
um, you know, a cult, which is basically any cult can exist in only one generation.
Yep.
That's why a lot of religious people are very anti-cults, because the check boxes are saying this way of experiencing spiritual power is not stable over generations. I think that's kind of what a cult is. Anyway,
Yeah.
and then the next one is not a philosophy, right? It's not just telling us things about nature, right? And it's not just abstractly doing. It's an embodied set of practice. It's not a set of beliefs, and it's not just vague spirituality, right? And I think, by the way, the beliefs is very important, because a lot of Christians very badly get hung up on belief, um, not realizing that belief is almost entirely irrelevant. It basically, this over indexing on belief is an evangelical thing,
Well, it's
where,
also
you
just a
know,
Protestant thing. Up until I believe it was Nerd Hat on that I have this in my brain. I believe it was only during the Fourth Lateran Council that the Catholic Church, so speaking purely from a Western perspective, I love Eastern Orthodoxy. It's very fascinating, beautiful traditions. I don't know anything about it, but from a Western Christian perspective only, it was only really in the Fourth Lateran Council that the Catholic Church actually defined what it was to be a practicing Christian. And you'd be surprised how minimalistic it was, because this is the Middle Ages, and you had to keep, again, that was sort of their version of minimal viable Catholicism, I guess.
yeah,
uh
yeah,
you are baptized, you go to confession at least once a year, and you take the Eucharist at least once a year. That was the minimum viable, at least fourth lat. Obviously, Catholicism has expanded much more in terms of requirements for lay people, but and there was, of course, tons of regional variations, of course. But in terms of that was their version. It's kind of basic, and it kind of
no,
and guess what? It doesn't have anything to do with belief. It is purely praxis related. It's orthopraxy. It's like, this is how you do it.
well,
Which
to
is
be,
interesting.
and that's just this, by the way, and so part of the point of this episode is not really to get all the way through the exercise in my
Oh yeah,
mind.
we're never gonna. Yeah,
It's to kind of, yeah, and I'm gonna
explore.
go post this podcast. I'm gonna go and continue to flesh out this idea on mine, and then I will write something up, and then hopefully we'll be able to continue this conversation over writing,
Oh yeah,
because that's
this is.
what
There's
all
no way we
good
can
projects are.
define.
Yeah.
We've worked out a working definition for sure of what DVR
Yeah.
is, but what it actually consists of is what. Yeah, we're just starting that now. There's no way we can get into that. But I think,
But one potential line of research actually that you just clarified for me is like, dude, at some point every religion starts to have this debate about what is a member,
yeah,
right? And so then go to that Fourth Lateran Council, or go to like understanding the Council of Nicaea, right? Those sorts of things. Every religion has that point. So maybe a research line would be to go through and ask your friends who are familiar with Hinduism or Buddhism or whatever, hey, at what point did they start saying you're a member, you're not a member?
yeah,
What were the things that were important? And then is there a commonality amongst all those conversations that would allow us to abstract into the minimal viable religion project, right? So
yeah.
that's kind of one thing.
Well, one thing.
The other
Yeah,
interesting
sorry.
thing about the things that you said for our conversation right now is that you have to be baptized, right? and that you, what was it, baptism, and then what was the other one?
Confession at least once a year, and Eucharist
Okay,
participation.
what's fast?
So which
Yeah.
is it's participation in sacraments, at least participation in
Which
Eucharist.
initially was just baptism and Eucharist, and then got expanded out for
Right,
good reasons.
I
potentially, yeah.
believe so. Don't quote. I'm not a sacramental historian, so I believe, but do not quote me on that. I'm going to be very hesitant about that because I'm a
Right,
I'm a
but
scholar of the Reformation, so I'm all about. I study my own group. I can tell you, right, like I know a lot about late medieval Catholicism just because it's what the Protestants were reacting to. Again, reacting, right, it's the paper towel thing, right? But yeah, like how I believe that it did. Yeah, the history of sacraments is interesting. I do think it was an expansion, but I might be wrong. So
well, so so kind of the point that I'm I guess getting at with here is that it's really interesting that already within our conversation spitballing, the Christians largely agree with us, right? That our first things were to define adulthood and continued existence, right? And baptism is to say is both an invitation into adulthood, at least in terms of, you know, in terms of
baptism, historically baptism is infant baptism is actually the norm. So,
or sorry, it's overcoming death. Sorry, it's overcoming death.
Yeah,
right. But it is but yeah, it's interesting where it's not necessarily required here, but obviously the tradition set up an initiatic experience.
Yep.
once baptism, which is of course you know, oh god, I forget the word. I'm dying tonight. God damn, dude.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, baptism is simulated death. Baptism is simulated death. It's actually simulated drowning, from a Christian perspective.
Waterboarding right off the bat, right?
Yeah.
But notice that you know. Oh, and they also have coordination with a priest. You know, so and this is where for me it's really important because a religion has experts in it.
Yeah.
Or you know, devotees, professional. Every religion has a professional class, which sort of both maintains the tradition and oversees, administers initiatic rites. And when I say it like that, it sounds like ridiculously corporate speak, but that's the point of corporations: is they have the minimum viable structures required to get things done, right? And so in this, it's going to sound very dry and boring and soulless, and that's kind of the point, right? Is that this is just the bones, right? This is just, you know, while the right is trying to figure out how to put its pants on, it's like, well, what are the underwears and socks of what we're talking about, right? Because everybody needs those things. So basically all I'm saying here is that you know, oh god, sorry dude, I'm just dying here, but anyway, you get what I'm trying to say.
I think people get what you're trying to say here. No, and I think, you know, this is something that I have a feeling we'll probably expand, either in probably both in writing and in future podcasts, future episodes. I do think I'm going to sort of start wrapping up, if I may. I think this this discussion of, not to gush too much and not to pat ourselves on the back too much, but I do think that this discussion is really good in and of itself. But I think it also, going from sort of the ground up, starting from the very beginning, I do think is very helpful, because you and I are working at sort of, this is to tease something else we're working on. We're sort of starting these exploration into the principles of the weird, capital W, right, as a flavor, a brand, a seasoned version of right-wing thought that attempts to deal with the hyper real and the hyper postmodern world that we live in. And I think I think that this concept of MVR sort of jives with what you and I have already been talking about. So I think I do, you know, the people who I've heard talk about MVR before, I think would be very happy to not to say that anyone owns a concept, but to allow us to use it in this way, because I think it is very postmodern, out of necessity, right? because it's looking at it sets aside objective spiritual reality for a second. It's not theology, it's just religious structure that,
Mhm.
like we've
Mhm.
been saying, but we'll say it one more time, seeks to build something proactionary, as you would say, seeks to
Mhm.
build, as opposed to just react against shit. How about you go out and do shit? Well, how do you do shit? You have to have a common blueprint. Well, what is that? I think that's what we're trying to get at here. So
Exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
it's one thing to say you have to man the walls against a barbarian. It's like, well, what training drills do you do in the meantime, right? What
exactly.
kind of food do you stock when siege occurs? What sort of alliances do you make across, the battlefield
Yeah,
that are rock solid, so that when the barbarians come to your gates, you got some backup.
you gotta light the beacons of Gondor. Okay,
There you go.
you gotta do it. You got no choice. You gotta light them. They're great. They're bright. They're bright. You got no choice. Elliot,
Our beacon of Gondor is good of just 1 foot higher.
Minas Tirith will have the most beautiful wall. It's the greatest fortification. Anyhow, I don't know what's happening. It's a Sunday evening. I think we'll stop torturing our viewers with poor impressions. And yeah, I wish everyone a really great next week. Elliot, I think we'll probably be back, hopefully. Imietza Hashem, God willing, again soon, to keep hashing this kind of stuff out. Like, comment, subscribe, all of those things. Micah Redding's blog about minimum viable theology, I will link to in the description, because it's well written and interesting. And yeah, Elliot, anything you want to plug or let people know about, or anything like that before we go?
No, nothing in particular. I mean, we'll chat more about the weird stuff next time. We've got a lot of stuff. Is the weird stuff, is that going to involve like the intertemporal
Yes,
warring and
the
stuff
time
like that?
war.
Okay, okay,
Yeah, it'll
got
get
it. Yeah,
timey-wimey.
yeah,
Yep, it'll
sweet.
get timey-wimey. Cool.
Make the timeline weird is one of my favorite podcasts says. So
Yes. All right. Everyone take it easy. And yeah, until next time, peace. Have a good one.
bye.